You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here in our final week discussing Miss Marple, her novel appearance, 10th novel appearance.
Oh my goodness.
The Caribbean Mystery by Agatha Christie.
She's turned double digits.
She has. Now, we'll discuss this later on in the episode, as we often do when we cover Christie. We might end up watching some of the adaptations next week on the program, but
I'm looking at it.
We'll ponder that before we get to the end of tonight's episode. But Herds.
Yeah, Flex.
This stretch of chapters, it's a little shorter than the others. It feels very different in tone from the rest of them. Effectively, what happens is we have our lead suspects all come out and do the most suspicious thing they possibly can right up to the very non-Miss Marple denouement.
It's very bizarre. I obviously am enjoying Miss Marple teaming up with Rafiel and his Tomcat Jackson, who he suspects nothing of.
He suspects that Jackson won't kill him at the very least.
He thinks that Jackson is too smart to kill him. But yeah, we interrogate this idea of Rafiel kind of being the usual target of the mystery some more. We have this lovely little scene where Jackson, I'm stuck on him now, he's like rummaging through Molly's things because she comes down with a sickness, some kind of drug sickness, which may or may not be real. I don't know that I'm entirely clear on that, but everybody's as suspicious as possible, as you say. The thing that is most marked for me, and this is not because I spent the last maybe half an hour trying to find a specific quote in the book. The thing that is most marked for me is that there's this weird literary bent that we get as we move towards the end of the novel, as Marple and Rafiel, as the old curmudgeonly start to take control. Marple starts calling herself Nemesis.
She like appears to Mr. Rafiel in the night wearing like a little pink knitted cap and says, "I am Nemesis.
I am the Nemesis," which is a Greek thing.
Also the name of the next book that they cross paths.
Crazy. I wonder why that would be. Also, Rafiel, as he's like leaving on a boat to see us again in the next book, he says in Latin, "We who are about to die salute you," I believe is what he says, which is saying that he's going to die. You know, again, referencing like classic literature. And the last one that is, it's only kind of half a reference, but there's a bit where the narration is talking about Jackson and says that he's not to reason why, he's but to do, which I believe is a reference to the charge of the Light Brigade. And all of these things, like they're all classic literature, but I think they're all to do with like war as well. Like there's a very military bent to the approach that we're taking to the end of this novel.
It is deeply bizarre, the sort of tact that the end of this novel takes. And I think most particularly because it feels like there's a strong sort of stop-start to all of the themes that happen towards the end of this book. Like, we start to suspect Jackson and then he ends up being our agent for the final scenes. We like point out that Lucky and Molly have the same haircut. Yes. Lucky dies immediately. It wasn't something we've been foreshadowing for a long time. It just kind of happened.
I mean, there's a few characters looking back that say like, I really wish I could kill Lucky, but like there's a lot of characters saying that about a lot of other characters. It's only because Lucky's hair is mentioned that we find her face down, hair up, in the sea, dead.
It's a perfectly fine murder mystery trope to kill two similar looking people where one of them died by accident because the other was the intended target. But it was just a bit last minute, I felt.
I don't know that it does much. It kind of shows that we're still trying to kill people.
The key thing that the novel itself points out, which is one of my other frustrations with the novel, is there's a lot of telling in this last part of the book. The novel tells you that what has happened is that because he's mistaken his target, our killer, Tim Kendall, is forced into a state of desperation and abruptly tries to kill Molly before she can tell anyone the truth.
It means that our climax can be having to wrest away the poison because the poison is the main method of killing and affecting events, right? It's the hallucinatory / deadly poison. And we can kind of have that climactic moment where Jackson reaches over and wrenches the poison drink from Tim Kendall's hand. And Marple says, well, now you can test that drink to see if it has poison in it. And so we can catch the poison killer. But then it begs the question, why didn't he just try to kill Lucky with the poison? And I guess it's because he'd have to look at her face to do it. So it's a little bit more convoluted than it needs to be, I think.
The setup is that he actually told Molly to go down to where Lucky ended up being, and she didn't go for various reasons.
She wandered off because of poison madness.
And there's also this thing where, like, up to the last moment, Molly is suffering this, like, persecution complex that clearly the drugs are giving her to some instance. And there's this weird scene where Miss Marple is sitting over watching her in bed after she's been deeply ill, and Miss Marple, like, catches her pretending to be asleep. But, like, it just kind of happens.
I'm a bit confused. What was she sick? Actually sick, or was it just pretend? Was that final bout of sickness just pretend? I'm a bit because why have the pretending to be sick if she actually is sick? Like, what is apart
she's
from
pretending
obfuscation, I
she's
guess.
pretending to be asleep, but she is actually unwell because she's been drugged.
Okay.
Like the whole
I just don't know why that's necessary.
Yeah, the whole killer's modus operandi for the other kills that the Major had heard about before the story even began was that he would drug his wives, make them delirious, and then create plausible circumstances in which to murder them via their delirium.
They all had a situation where they would almost die, but then die for real the next time. And that's because our killer isn't actually very good at killing. I thought it might have been like, I like to almost kill people and then kill them for real, but I think it's just because he's bad at his job.
I don't actually agree. I think the point was that he makes them seem depressed enough that he almost kills them once.
Oh, I see what you mean.
To make it seem like they're trying to kill themselves, so that when they actually succeed, it seems obvious. Because there's a clue that Miss Marple gives us right up towards the end where it says it's not the people who are always talking of killing themselves, threatening to do so who do it. They dramatize themselves that way and let off steam. And Miss Marple is basically telling us as the audience in that moment that, no, Molly is not actually trying to kill herself.
Yes. I suppose I felt that was fairly obvious at the time. But yeah. And on all these other murders, Major Palgraves and Victoria and Lucky have all been, I mean, Lucky was an accident, but the rest of them have just been to kind of cover things up, which has not gone well.
Overall, this book still is really fun. It's still a really engaging Miss Marple story for a lot of the reasons that we've been discussing, but it is very self-evident in a way where you really have to rely on the other themes and moves of the book to kind of get anything substantive out of it, which I think is part of why that literary bent starts to show up towards the end.
Yeah, I'm thinking more about it as we're talking, and obviously the military part that I'm kind of zoning in on is because of Major Palgraves, right? Like, we start with an ex-military man's stories of a time long past, and we end on, here are these classical, poems and tales and Latin translations of military campaigns and betrayals from yesteryear.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if this draft sat on a shelf for a very long time and then the last little bit came out all at once. Because one of the other things that's sort of interesting is up until the literary bent sort of starts, we've been going through the usual suspect exploration that we get out of crime fiction, but specifically that we sort of do one meta archetype of role in society at a time. We do the young couple, we do the parents, we do the religious siblings, we do the military man, we do the business owners, we do the foreigners.
Although the actual theme that we mostly rely on for, I would say, everything in between those two bookends is to do with married couples. So trying to align, the middle section is about married couples and how bad that relationship can get, basically. And I mean, there is some talk even in the epilogue where Marple's telling Molly, you ended up with a horrible husband, but I hope that you find someone else, basically, which is a very wholesome way to end it.
I think one of the other things that's really interesting is I'm so curious as to what Agatha Christie was concerned about as she was writing this. Because, for example, there's a passage in chapter 18 where Miss Marple and Miss Prescott are talking about Molly's family history. And they have this moment where she says, Molly never got on well with her mother. So few girls seem to. And it's such a pity because a girl really needs her mother's knowledge of the world and experience. Let me contextualize this for you. At the same time as I had been reading this book, I was reading Tim Ailiff's The Wrong Man, which should be next week on the show. And I was really struck by how Tim's book was very, very show, don't tell. And this was unusually tell even for Agatha Christie. And I feel like there's probably a part of that that's coming down to the familial and personal marriage and family stuff that was going on in her life at the time. But it's very hard to see that context through the abstraction of the book.
I mean, regardless of Chrissy's state of mind, at least she's still given Marple stuff to do. My personal highlight of this book is when she's following, is it Jackson at the time?
It is Jackson.
She's still following, I can't get Jackson out of my head, that tomcat. He's wormed his way in. He's so suave. But she's like, she sees him wandering around. She's supposed to be asleep at the time. And so she like breaks the heel off of one of her high-heeled shoes, I guess, and lies down on the floor outside of the window that he's next to, because he's rifling through Rafiel's stuff.
Jackson's role in the latter part of the story is that he's been breaking into everyone's bungalows, and Miss Marple finally gets enough of sitting around watching this happen and decides to go up close, but needs plausible deniability.
And so she pulls the heel off and lies down in front of the window so that if he does happen to come out or somebody happens to see her, she could say, oh, well, I'm just an old lady and I fell over. I'm always a fan of the detective and sidekick sort of pairs that use the sidekick as the legs. I guess in this case it was literal, as Miss Marple is like lying on the floor, unable to move, while Jackson is looking through the evidence at the time. But it is by no means an amicable relationship in that particular scene.
Well, I mean, one of the other things that's really interesting about Jackson's role as a character is that he is the legs, but he's not the usual agreeable set of legs that the detective has.
No. Well, he has to be motivated with money, which is what Rafiel is really here for, which is quite fun, actually. I like that rather than him being the murder target, he's there to motivate the legs. That's quite a fun idea.
That overall relationship with Mr. Rafiel is, I think, the strongest part overall in the book. I think that little hook to kind of engage you through to the final pages, their relationship, their growing respect. I don't want to give Nisio Isin too much credit here.
Oh, okay, yep.
But it definitely did have me thinking if certain characters in Zaragoza were actually a reference to Mr. Rafiel in a weird way.
We would never give Zaragoza any sort of credit.
No, and nor should we. Nor should we. But it did remind me how sad I was, that how atrocious the screen adaptation of that was.
I try not to think about it. You are getting me wondering about the Christie adaptation of A Caribbean Mystery. That could be fun.
It could be fun.
Yeah.
We will be back to talk a little bit more about this, in particular the way the mystery unfurls towards the end in the final portion of the show today. Stick around. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour on 2SER 107.3, Death of the Reader.
You're listening to Death of the Reader, and joining me in the booth right now I have returning guest author Michael Brissenden, Brisso to his friends, to continue our chat about his recently released novel, Smoke. Do you feel that crime fiction is a good avenue for exploring these voices of marginalized groups? Do you feel like the genre kind of lends itself to that narrative?
I really do. It's a great way to tell these stories. Crime fiction is going through this incredible renaissance at the moment, but the best of it does cover all of these issues in a way that is an entertaining read. Somebody can get a great sense of enjoyment out of actually reading it, be very entertained, but also get to the end of it and go, oh, like there were a lot of interesting things in there that I hadn't really thought about, and this book has actually made me think. In a way, that's what the liberating thing for me as a journalist is, doing that in a way that is not about banging someone over the head with an essay. This is about taking somebody on hopefully a very entertaining journey, getting to the end of it, raising a whole lot of issues, solving some, not solving a lot of them, but, making people think about it. Hopefully people come away at the end of it thinking they had a good read, but they also picked up a couple of other things.
It reminds me of the work of Rex Stout, the novel Too Many Cooks. That novel has a scene wherein the detective Wolf sits down with all of the servants at this event, and of course they're all people of color, right?
Yeah.
and he makes it very clear to them that they're not going to be punished in this situation, but that he needs them to solve the crime because they're the servants. They've seen everything, and that's very much a trope.
You've got to reflect real life too. We're writing genre. You've got to write a believable setting, and it's sometimes very annoying when you read a novel, particularly this sort of new bush noir novels, and it's sort of essentially a whole lot of relatively privileged middle-class white people wandering around. It's not like that. I mean, these towns are not like that.
I feel like I know the answer to this question, but I have been given a list of talking points by your publisher to discuss with you today. One of the talking points says that though you have worked as a foreign correspondent with the American police, there was still a substantial amount of research that you needed to do. I'd like to know what shape that research took in terms of talking to police officers. I imagine it's very similar to what you've just told me, that you went and talked to people, but I'd love to know a bit more about that, I guess.
It's a difficult point, because if you set a novel like that in somewhere like New South Wales, or Victoria, or Western Australia, there's one police service. So someone like this main character can go and be sort of under investigation and be furloughed to a small town, no problem at all. They're still in the same police service. In California, there's something like 76 different police jurisdictions, so it's a much more difficult thing to do. Plus, I needed to know where my 43-year-old white female character would live in Los Angeles because they don't get paid a lot of money. They don't like to live in the neighbourhoods that they police for obvious reasons because you don't want to be walking the streets with the people you're locking up. All of that sort of detail had to be right. I had to know how an internal affairs investigation worked, whether it was possible to be furloughed for a time and put somewhere else. So, I did have a lot of questions for police. Before I left, I got in touch with, it was like a journalistic exercise, it was like going on a Four Corners shoot or a foreign correspondent shoot. I got all these, addresses of people. I emailed people, I contacted people over Twitter, cops and whatever. And there were a few who got back to me and they all just basically said, oh, look, I don't know, if I'm around, yeah, but I'm not sure what my movements are. It wasn't very firm. And so I left and I didn't really have any contacts and I didn't really know what I was going to do. I got to LA and I thought, I've got to go and talk to the police somehow. So I had a hire car and I drove up to the police academy. The police academy is just like it is in the movies, that white building. And I drove into the car park, no security whatsoever, drove straight into the car park. There's a live firing exercise going off in a paddock next door. I walked straight up to the front door, no security, walked straight through the front door, straight through the next door, which was the armory. And all these guys are strapping on their bulletproof vests and they're checking their guns and whatever. And this guy says to me, well, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm an Australian writer. I'd just like to ask someone a few questions. He said, oh, come with me. I'll take you to the chief. So he took me down to the chief's office. The chief wasn't there, but a 43-year-old female sergeant was there. And she gave me all the time I needed. We had a couple of hours. She told me everything. She told me how an internal affairs investigation works, where this person would live, how they would get around, how they would behave. It was a fantastic stroke of luck in some ways. But that's the thing about America as well. If you tried to do that at Surrey Hills Police Station here in Sydney, they'd, no way. You'd be turned away before you even got to the door.
I guess they feel safe with all those guns there.
Yeah, I guess they do. Yeah.
I guess that's how that works. That is kind of interesting, the 43-year-old police officer. Yeah. I guess you found your Alex pretty easily.
Amazing. Yeah.
It's incredible.
I did the same thing in some of the regional towns I went to. We just knocked on the door of the police station and asked to talk to them. Americans generally are quite happy to talk, especially if you're, bold enough to approach them straight up.
So this is entirely a personal question, but when I told my lovely parents about the premise of your book, they were shocked that you were able to write a novel that is both about climate change and police corruption. How could the two even come in the same room together? What would you like to say to people who find the very premise of your novel incredulous?
Well, I don't think it's incredulous at all. The two issues are sort of separate in many ways. I mean, look, there's police corruption. Police corruption is a never-ending story. But the fact that they're also engaged in corrupt activity on behalf of a developer is also not so far-fetched. The fact that a developer is taking advantage of a town in crisis after a natural disaster has gone through is not something that wouldn't happen. I mean, these things create opportunities for all sorts of people. And suddenly, there's the point about the development pressures in little towns like this. Something like this happens and people go, we have to rebuild. Things have to be done. And so shortcuts are taken all the time when there's pressure on them to do things fast. And I just wove the police corruption into that story. So
I should be clear, I don't think it was incredulous. I just was having a hard time pitching to my parents to get them to read the book. So I should also say I was having a chat with your old colleague and Twisty Hour station manager, Paula Kruger. I am outing her. And she has outed you as an extremely proficient radio reporter from the past. And she'd like to know how your previous work, sort of writing reports, keeping things punchy, has influenced your writing style for Smoke.
I think, as I mentioned before, I think often what we have to do as journalists, we're very good at deadlines, right? We're very good at writing things fast. We're very good at the short, clipped sort of narrative. And I think that works in crime fiction, and I do think that works to push the story along pretty hard. But again, we do have, as journalists, a tendency to over-explain stuff, and you always have to be on the lookout for journalese in your fiction writing because the two actually are quite different. And I think I've done a pretty good job this time of stripping it back. There's a way of overwriting and there's a way of writing too much detail. And you have to guard against doing all of that, but you've got to keep the poetry in it. That's the challenge.
I think, honestly, you've done such an excellent job of writing this book, depicting all the inanimate and animate parts of the story with the wildfires and the small towns and the big towns, and making sure that the characters are complex enough but not overbearing. This is a review show, but I think you've done an excellent job of all of that. So well done.
Thank you.
I have to ask, before we run out of time, what are you writing next? Can you talk about it?
Yeah, well, there will be another Alex Markov novel. I think because there's a lot of unfinished business with her. She's a pretty complex character. I reckon there's certainly another one in that. And this book is going pretty well, and I think there'll be an appetite for another one.
That was our chat with Michael Brissenden, author of Smoke and acclaimed journalist and American correspondent. Thank you so much for joining us to spill all of your secrets to me, but it is now time for Flex and I to spill every last drop of secret from the poisonous flower that is a Caribbean mystery. In this, our final segment covering the Christie novel, you're listening to Death of the Reader. Stay tuned to 2SCR 107.3.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here in our final week. All spoilers on the table for Agatha Christie's The Caribbean Mystery, the 10th Miss Marple novel, and Herds. I thought that this mystery overall was fundamentally strong, but really clinically weak.
I mean, what happens plot-wise? Lucky dies. That's what happens. Like Molly has her drug-induced problem. Like all that happens, but like what actually occurs because of that? We set up the actual murder. I feel like we could have started the book with Molly getting sick, and she kind of is getting sick throughout the book. So like what has functionally changed?
I think that is meant to be one of our clues. I think one of the strengths of this book, this is a very beginner's mystery in the sense that, we have that big sequence where they basically tell you exactly what's going on and then give you a few reasons to doubt and are sort of teaching you how to think about the mystery. There is a strength to the approach there, but it is very beginner friendly in a way that I respect. It doesn't really take away from my enjoyment of the book, but does mean that the mystery is a bit like face value to discuss. I don't feel like I can sit here and go like, and the fact that he was sitting next to the same flowers from the picture.
No, it's not even the same flower. It's a hibiscus, which I mean, maybe that's another poisonous flower.
But it was the same picture that was like in the photo that Palgrave mentioned.
Sure.
There are some layers to it, but it's not like the tidy.
No, it's not super clean. I will say one of the sleights of hand that Christie pulls very late in the novel is when Esther Walters is talking about. So Marple thinks that she's talking about who the killer is, and Marple's got in the mindset of trying to figure out whether it's a at this point because of the aforementioned author attempt to throw us off, just telling us what the mystery is, that it's definitely a guy who's doing it. But Esther is saying she should just hurry up and leave already and then everything would be solved. And so Marple is thinking in this scene, she must be the killer. Here's another clue that we're dealing with a female killer. Interesting. What does Esther know that I don't? But actually, she's talking about Molly because she wants Molly to go away so that she can marry Tim Kendall. I liked that scene.
Molly's whole inkling towards the end of this story is that Tim has been telling Esther that Molly has been cheating on him, and so he's been wooing Esther under the guise that his marriage is about to collapse, and he loves her, actually, and he's so grateful to have found someone like her, but also she has an inheritance coming from Mr. Rafiel.
That we don't necessarily know about, but Jackson knows about, and he told Esther. I mean, that's fine. Like, the pipeline of information is fairly solid. We go from master to servant that likes to snoop to servant that doesn't like to snoop to person that she's banging. Like, that's the pipeline of information there. That's fine. My solution didn't actually need this piece of information because they make it very clear that Esther is receiving a bunch of money from Rafiel as long as he's alive. So I don't know that this was necessary, but it's fine. Like it makes sense within the story.
It's one of those things where I thought the same, that it was like clever, it was clean, it was well laid out. I think it teaches you how to think, but like the cleverness of it is that it is a concise and linear piece of information that takes an abstract point of view to understand. It's not like the most complex thing. There aren't a ton of layers to it.
Let's be clear. Information and how the information is dispersed is a core part of the mystery. And so even if it's not a required clue nubbin to puzzle out by the end of the story, understanding how all of these different couples, because they're all catty, scandalous marriages that are falling apart, as Christie hates. We do need to do some digging to understand how information is being disseminated throughout the island. We are supposed to think about all these characters with the various relationships to each other. How can we use that network to get information from person A to person X, right? Which is kind of fun.
It is. And I think the key thing is that as good as all of these individual pieces are, in the same way that the closing chapters of this book kind of feel like a semi-unrelated coda to the rest of the story, a lot of the clues feel like they are missing their actual conclusion. For example, the whole thing with Esther, it's like, they were secretly courting each other.
But Esther wasn't doing anything in the story.
There was nothing of consequence that actually comes of that. It's just kind of the checkbox exercise for the motivation.
It's so that she can run in at the last second and go, "No, Tim, don't put him away. He's my love. He would never kill anybody." And then Tim's like, "I'll kill you next." Especially those of you in the jury.
Also felt very flat because Esther had seemingly been such a reasonable character the rest of the story. And the same thing where, like, Lucky dies, and it's like, and then her husband's relationship changed.
To nothing. He briefly threatens to kill Miss Marple, but then Marple's like, there are other people on the island, right? And he goes, maybe I shouldn't become a murderer today.
There's just all of this stuff that starts and just never feels like it ends.
It's kind of bizarre, honestly. Again, it's all part of that core theme of, like, couples are bad, ban marriage. Because he was really very progressive when you think about it. But none of it is, like, super clean, except for that constant theme of poison and the two military literary bookends. But yeah, in terms of actual, like, character motivations and arcs, I guess Rafiel goes on an arc. He learns to trust Miss Marple. I mean, that's probably the strongest part of the story.
It really is.
Anyway, we're in the mystery section, but
but that's kind of the thing, right? Is that all of these things do lend themselves towards nice clues that build up the mystery, like the relationship drama between the couples, like who goes on what walks when with who. All of these things are there and have interest and do commit something to the mystery of the story. But the story doesn't ever give anything back to the clues.
It's all kind of just context and flavor, right?
It threatens so many times to have a framing device. It threatens to pitch marriages against each other. It threatens to pit flora against each other. But nothing quite sticks.
Even with the flower poison stuff, I enjoy that this is the murder weapon and we're using it in lots of different ways. That's fun. But, like, where is he getting the flower from? What was the point of the cables? I'm just saying.
And why? Why does Dr. Graham not show up for the last, 6 chapters that everyone says, oh, we'll go get Dr. Graham now?
Well, yeah. I mean, he's there long enough to be like, oh, I think that it's not really a murder at all, but maybe it is. And then as soon as Rafiel says...
He does nothing of consequence.
Well, this is the thing. As soon as Rafiel says, it's a poison that only a doctor could pronounce, the doctor disappears from the story.
Exactly.
Because he could have done something. He would have come on scene and said, she's suffering from that poison, and solved it, right? Like, it's very bizarre.
This book is a good, fun, light-hearted Miss Marple read, but it is so many first steps not followed by the second. And I think the book is charming enough that, interestingly, that doesn't frustrate me, but it does make it very hard to, recommend with a ringing endorsement. Now, Herds, I guess the question I'm left with is your next pick.
Well, I have the next book fired away, and you are going to be solving it, but I would appreciate a little bit more time to kind of seep my bones in the sand dunes of this particular novel. And find the blood, let's say.
I believe there are 3 main English-speaking adaptations of this.
Oh, good lord.
Who knows if we want to go back to Miss Mar Nemesis.
I was going to say non-English speaking? That sounds fun.
There's the Joan Hickson version, there is the Helen Hayes version, and there is the Julia Mackenzie version.
Do you know which one is the least well-rated?
I think what we will do, Herds, is like the last few times we have covered a Christie screen adaptation, I think we'll leave that as a bit of a show and tell. You can find the nightmare you wish upon us.
Because look, when
I
bring
it to the class,
what was it even called? The Alphabet Murders. That was maybe my favorite find of cinema history.
I know.
What an absolute crap show. So yeah, look, I'm excited to find the least popular adaptation of Agatha Christie's Caribbean Mystery.
Sounds
It's going
good.
to be great.
If people want to get a head start on their reading for Michael Tearawa Bennett's book that we're covering after this, Return to Blood.
We're going to be reading chapters 1 to 11. We'll look into it.
Thank you so much for joining us for this little portion of Agatha Christie's The Caribbean Mystery. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour here on 2SER 107.3. We'll be back with some more Miss Marple next week, the screen adaptations, and then Michael Tearawa Bennett's Return to Blood the week after that. Catch you then. This is Death of the Reader. We're out of here.